want to welcome you to Genesis chapter 10. And in this chapter, we are going to study about the sons of Noah and the 70 other people and the nations that are addressed in Genesis chapter 10. It's a beautiful study, and it's a wonderful thing if you pay attention to the study of the genealogy. So Noah and his children is what we're going to do. The most boring of all chapters is what I want to say. Every time I read the scripture with this genealogy, I want to say, like Genesis chapter 10, all you read are the names of people. And then I tell myself, yes, I got it. Can we just move on? Let us just move on. Noah had all these sons and wives and their children and grandchildren. All of that is so true. None of these people live like they should. Of course, that's according to my standards. I don't think they have lived according to what, like the sons of the prophets. That's not something that I've seen. And so I want to ask that question. All right, we have heard a lot about all these names. Can we now live like the children of Noah? And so one day, as I was studying this chapter again, I realized that the writers had to work hard to come up with 70 names in that chapter. That was not easy. Of course, they'd had to break some rules to get to that place. This chapter is known as the Table of Nations. Chapter is known as the Table of Nations. Here is a story of these 70 nations. To make it 70 nations, not 25, I'm sure the writers had to invent names and put things together in order to achieve this classical biblical number of 70. You all know the classical biblical number of 770, the number of perfection, and it is the number of completion. There must be a reason for it. Now, when we look into that, Walter Bregman, one of my favorite biblical scholars and teachers in the world, gave me some insight into it when he said, this is an unparalleled ecumenical vision of human reality. Unparalleled ecumenical vision of human reality. The Table of Nations declares the interconnectedness of all people. At the same time, when it was written, the authors only spoke of the known world. Remember that. At the time of this writing of this book, they are talking about the world that they knew, not about the Near Eastern countries or the nations outside their purview. It was what they knew and what they believed. God was the author of all, no matter what it is that they thought of, and brought the world to perfection by making 70 nations after the flood. So in their mind, when they were thinking about these 70 nations, those are the nations that they knew, and they knew no matter what, no matter how many nations they were in, this must be 70 nations of completeness and perfection that God has seen and God is happy with, and all the world created by God is in these 70 nations. The number 70 meant for them perfection, and of course for the people, in the eyes of God, it was complete. So why not go with the 70 that would encompass all nations of the known world? I think that's a great thought. So the point here is that even though the worldview of the writers thousands of years ago was so limited and so narrow, their hearts were in the right place. They knew no matter who lived where, they were designed and loved by God, and therefore no matter what sin they or their ancestors committed, they all belonged to the same God. They believed God was the author of life, and therefore their names deserved to be mentioned, brought into the sacred text. That way generations will come to know them and read about them. Nothing, no color or creed or gender or ethnicity mattered to the writers, because the entire world had only one author according to them, and that one author is God. Therefore, the 70 nations were a sign of God's complete perfection. In short, our DNA comes from the same source and the same origin. The tale of the nations points to the ultimate power of God over humanity. Now that we have made sense on this, Nimrod, one of the sons of Cush, one of the grandchildren of Noah, was a conqueror. He was greedy and he was not satisfied with all what he had. If you read, you will find he conquered the first 4 nations, the next 4 nations. He went conquering nations after nations. He conquered lands and kept building them rather than be satisfied with what he got, rather than be happy with what he got. He kept conquering, he kept building. Of course, he must have been called to do it. It's about power and prestige, and that's what we find. It did not matter what exactly went on in the end. God is still in charge through the ruthlessness of Nimrod. The story is not about the perfection of what mankind does, but rather the perfection of the plan of God. That's what the story is about. That is what brings us together as the people of God. Every time I read genealogy, I find the constant reminder to us that the story is not to limit our lineage, but to expand it and connect it to God as the author of all lives. St. Augustine of Hippo would say, peace in society depends upon peace in the family. That's right. Peace in the society depends on peace in the family. The same idea is rephrased by Mother Teresa when she said, we do not have world peace because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. I had mentioned this before. As Mother would say, we belong to each other, and that's where our strength comes from. And because of that, we can actually, if we understand that we belong to one another, we will continue, we will love to understand and accept one another. This chapter of Genesis simply states that we have an interconnectedness as one human family that shares the same DNA with God. God found it to be perfect and beautiful. And therefore, the story goes to 70 people, to 70 nations, to 70 differences, and to 70 problems of everyday life. In all that happens in life, around God, there is perfection. If only we could believe we are all the sons and daughters of Noah, which in reality, if we believe in the scripture, we have to believe it, that we are the sons and daughters of Noah after the flood. When everything was destroyed, when we came out, if we want to go with that story, we have to believe it. The writers of the Bible want us to believe in the unity of the world and not the uniformity of our behavior. It's a unity of the world under one God is the whole story. So, the solution to the problem that we have, ever-increasing population, is simply the multiplication of divine love and a chance for us to see the wealth of God's understanding of differences in us. That's a wealth. The differences in us is the wealth. True transformation lies in our ability to see perfection in God's creation, just like the writers of Genesis chapter 10 did. The 70 people or the 70 nations demonstrated this complete perfection of God's plan. Whether we understand it or not, that actually shows the perfection of God's design, and the writers believed in it. Every person on earth is part of that 70 nations club, meaning a club of people that shared in the same DNA, the God's DNA. We have more reason to be at peace with each other and the world than ourselves. So the point is that if we are kind, if we are compassionate, if we can be loving, if we can be accepting, we can actually belong to that 70s club or the 70 club, the club that has come to the completion and perfection that God has seen in each one of us. Genesis chapter 10, with all the names that even for us to remember or to pronounce, it simply points to the fact that we belong to one human family.